iteration as a euphemism for rework. Or we only want to iterate in a really intelligent, smart way. We don't want to iterate because we didn't think things through and we just put something out there hoping for the best. And then we have to iterate and we have to redo it, because also that's really disruptive to the user. So like when we're not, this OAUX it's a language around UX. It's a great way to document requirements and explore all these levels of complexity. And it's a great way to prevent these changes that happen later in the process, or even these changes that might need to happen in production.
Today I talk with Sophia Prater. She is a UX educator, consultant, and founder of the object-oriented UX framework. Sophia's mission is to harmonize design and engineering, and then also provide ways for product managers to more granularly prioritize a bulletproof software architecture and information architecture. We discuss its implications for developers, designers, and product managers. Sophia shares her personal experiences in the field, and together we explore the vital nuances of UX design and system architecture. Listen to this episode if you want to reduce rework, bulletproof your software architecture, and make it easier to try more things out. And just a quick note, I took her course. I did the self-paced course, and what I learned in that is a big contributor to how I got promoted to lead designer last year. So if you're interested in the course, we do provide a link in the show notes to a 10% discount if you are interested after listening. All right, let's get started. Welcome to The Way of Product. I'm your host, 𝗕𝗂𝗵𝗀𝘀𝘀, and this podcast is for product professionals who eventually want to run their own product org one day. The average tenure of a product leader is 2 years. 2 years, because they fail to make an impact with their teams. I want to figure out how the best product teams and creative technologists tick, with the goal of putting it all into a book. And I want to document the progress and behind the scenes with you as I write it in the coming years. Do you want to get the book for free? Then jump over to 𝗨𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗃.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and I'll send you a draft of the book's introduction in a public Google Doc. So if you've benefited from this show in any way, if you enjoy your work more, you got unblocked from limiting belief, go to 𝗨𝗵𝗀𝗃.com, show some love, and join the newsletter crew. I appreciate it, and I promise to continue to make the show and newsletter more and more valuable as the years go on. Now, let's get back to the good stuff. Thanks for hanging out. Hey listener, today my guest is Sophia Prater. She is a UX designer, educator, consultant, and the founder of the object-oriented UX framework and course. Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Caden. Fun to be here.
So Sophia, before we get started, can you just briefly introduce yourself to the listener, let them know your what, why, how, and like how you got to where you are, and we'll get started.
Yeah. How far back do you want me to go?
Your most formative moment when you decided.
Oh, do you want me to go back to when I was 8 years old and I was basically designing frameworks as an 8-year-old? Because I was when I was 8 years old. But I'll go back a little bit and then I'll speed up. We don't need to go back that far. But I do like to going back and looking at the stuff that I was doing when I was a kid, what I was doing for fun, when nobody was paying me. It is very similar to what I'm doing today. I was a huge nerd. I liked to design games. I liked to design experiences. I just crack up. I found recently this piece of paper and I had designed a summer camp. And it was like I had the bird's eye view of the summer camp. This is where the lake is, and this is where people do archery. And here's a little path from the lake to the archery, and here's where the arts and crafts is. But I also had a schedule. It was like, this is what people are doing at 8 a.m. And then we had grilled cheese on Monday at noon. And then at lunch on Tuesday, we have hot dogs. And it was just like this whole agenda was planned out. And I'm like 9 years old doing this. So I'm basically doing very similar things today. I create courses and training. And then I go and the stuff that I create courses and training on, I go and bring it to companies and I do the work. And I basically go do the work so that I can create better trainings. And then I create better training so that I can do the work better. And I loop back and around and around. One of my favorite sayings is teach what you need to learn. That has been a mantra throughout my life. So I teach and then I learn it and then I go and do it and I learn more and then I go back and I teach it. And I just bought between those worlds. But I grew up as a UX designer. My actual background is in industrial design. So I went to Georgia Tech for industrial design. I graduated in 2006 2006, did a little bit of an internship, and then basically everything went to hell in 2008. I was unemployed for a while. I moved into my parents' basement, the whole 9 yards. And then I got hired as a UE designer, no, a UE analyst, as for user experience, by Accenture. So I started off in a large consulting conglomerate, whatever you want to call Accenture. It's like too big to call it even an agency. And I was dropped in on really complicated projects, like straight into B2B insurance is where I started off. And I'm 23 years old or something. I don't understand my own insurance, much less what I would need to design for a professional insurance professional who is working on B2B insurance packages. And I get there day one as a UX designer, and they're like, okay, like here's some wireframes from the old UX designer, and we need you to change this and this. And can you have wireframes to us by Friday? And then we'll do a review. And I'm looking at them like, say what? I don't understand any of this. I don't understand what any of these pieces are that I'm looking at. I don't understand what these buttons mean. I don't understand what this UI means. I have no idea I don't really understand what insurance is.
What does success look like?
I don't understand even. I understood what they were asking, but they were asking me to move the deck chairs around on something where I didn't understand the engine. I didn't understand the boat. I don't know how that analogy works. But I was basically asked to do UX on a very surface level and not really have full understanding and do it very quickly. And this was repeated at all the places that I went. And the first 5 years of my career were extremely frustrating. I came home crying a lot, basically because I feel like I was set up to fail. I was dropped into complexity and not really given good tools to handle that complexity and do really good work, really good systemic design where I was going to be making changes that actually mattered. Thus, I started creating this process, started reading a lot of books. I got introduced to the concepts of object-oriented programming, and I was thinking, I wonder if this could maybe apply to UX, these things like encapsulation and reuse and thinking about the main concepts and concept modeling. So I started getting into that. And the more I got into it and the more I learned about it, the more it helped me in my work. Big formative moment that I write about. Maybe some of your listeners have heard the story before if they've read the article from 2015, what I call the dinosaur article on A List Apart, called Object-Oriented UX. I talk about being at CNN and having to do responsive design for the very first time. And that's where I really started thinking modularly and thinking about creating reusable parts and we can get into more of the story of CNN if we want to go there, but that's all out there on the internet. And basically, I continued to use these different methods, learn as much as I could from people that had come before me doing similar things. And I can mention some of those references. Definitely 𝗕𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗃's Object-Oriented User Interfaces that was written in the 90s by a developer. And then some books on content strategy as well. And from an object-oriented perspective, a content perspective, a UX strategy perspective, basically that turned into object-oriented UX, which is what I teach today in the Orca process.
Perfect. Disclaimer, like I took Sophia's course, just to explain to the listener, this is like one of the main reasons why I had her on the show. I take a lot of courses. I was like one of the first to do Shift Nudge, which is a UI design intensive. I was like the third person to graduate the beta class to test it out. Whenever I just have a gut of like, oh, this is probably good education. I think one of the heuristics for me that led to me buying into your course, which has been an amazing investment, and I could go into a little bit like high level, like how it's benefited my career, was that when the first company, the company I interned at when I started my career still had like a pension program. So there was a lot of like old timers there. And if anyone understands like the true history of UX, the early UX designer was a engineer at a company that cared about human factors. And so that makes a lot of sense, like that there's books written about object-oriented interfaces way back in the day. The framework that I was taught from a lot of these like old school UX designers who were engineers at one point in their career was user environment design, contextual design. And so learning how to like set up like the software as a house blueprint, like the model of like you're navigating a house, you walk in the living room and there's a toilet in the corner and you're like, wait, toilet shouldn't be in the living room. and then you call up the contractor and they're like, well, it was to like save money and we just wanted to like ship.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, is toilets go in all the wrong places in the world of software, and we just don't, because it's abstract and like a 2D interface, like we don't think that something's off until we ship it, or we wonder why conversions are down or why customers aren't able to navigate our app. And like when I saw this and I watched your videos, I'm like, add to cart, do it. And it's been pretty amazing. I think maybe just have a quick, maybe we start with a very basic principle. One thing I will say, it's a very dense course.
You
It's
get
not
your
like
money's worth, right?
It's very rich and I like to, when I explain to people, I'm like, oh, it's kind of like systems architecture for designers or product managers, because it follows how entity relationship diagrams are drawn. Like if anyone's not familiar with that diagram, it's what software architects use to architect a software system. And it's kind of funny because that influences the information architecture. And so and most software architects work in a vacuum, like in a silo. Like they're not like embedded in teams. Taking this course, I was able to partner with a software architect very closely.
Nice.
And influence. And right after I was wrapping up the course, we did a big re-architecture project. I pitched to be on that team. And thanks to object-oriented UX, like the framework, it allowed me to heavily influence and then also get the respect of engineers, because they're like, oh, this is all very technical. And I'm like, dude, no, it's like tables and rows and lines, like cardinality lines. Like you guys like oversell the hard part of this. Like once I figured out, I'm like, oh my gosh, software is just a bunch of like tables and lines connecting them. And I'm like, it's a lie. Like it's not that hard. Conceptually,
The design part is, it could be, there's definitely hard parts about it, but it's definitely accessible, right? It should not be just in so many areas of UX, should not be just UX. So many areas of system architecture should not just be system architects. We should be collaborating more, basically.
Yeah. And so for you, like what was the inception story besides all the stuff that you just explained? Like the kind of like the moment where you realize, oh, I've proven out this framework, because I'm sure you typed it and tested it out in your day-to-day. Like what was like the moment where you're like, okay, this is working pretty consistently?
The benefits were immediate. Even the reason that this all started is because the CNN election results project worked. It was a success. It was a success against a lot of odds. And I was asked to speak about that and say, what made this a success? And so then I had to reflect and think, oh, what are the, and I had these 5 things that I mentioned. I called the talk the simplicity imperative. And those things I was immediately rolling in to everything that I did. One of them was prioritization, just thinking about, okay, what are the attributes that need to be on this page? What are the things that need to be on this page? Before we start getting into design, let's just figure out like, what is high priority and what is low priority? Can we just do that? Because I want to keep that prioritization consistent as a thing shows up across various contexts. So with CNN, it could be a candidate, okay? So if that candidate, if I say first name and last name is the most important and probably party is most important, that prioritization should likely change as a candidate shows up in various contexts. If I do want to change that prioritization for context, then I want to be really intentional about it. So things like that, things like reduce the number of moving parts. These have changed. These have evolved into this language that we use in OUX where we talk about shapeshifters and masked objects. So a masked object is 2 different objects that are wearing the exact same outfit. You see this in cards, the homepage card, and anything can go in the homepage card. And what you end up having, going back to this idea behind OUX, that people think in objects, and when they go into an environment, whether that's digital or physical, they need to be able to recognize the objects. And if 2 objects that are very different look exactly the same, which we do in the digital world all the time, it's going to be confusing. This would be confusing in the real world, and it's confusing in the digital world. And then we have the flip side of our shapeshifters, where we have the same object that completely arbitrarily changes shape and attribute prioritization as it shows up in the 25 different places across product. This is also confusing. It's confusing when something changes shape arbitrarily. It's confusing in the real world. It's confusing in the digital world too. So like I didn't have names for those back then, but I was immediately starting to try to avoid those shapeshifters and those masked objects. We also talk about isolated objects where two things are connected through the mental model. Two things are connected in just truth of the world, and yet they are not connected in the digital world. Sophia V just did a great article. I just posted it. It's on LinkedIn. And she was basically analyzing the Denver Zoo's website for all of these shapeshifters, masked objects. We also have broken objects and isolated objects. And I loved her example of isolated objects. So to give just an example of kind of the thinking behind OUX, I'll use the Denver Zoo because it's a great example. So really any zoo has animals, penguins being an instance of an animal, lions being an instance of an animal. And we've got some instances, penguins, lions, tigers, bears.
Enclosures.
So we call them habitats. So habitats would be probably different than the animal because you could have multiple habitats potentially for a single animal. All right. You could also have demos. So demos are events. This is where we're going to feed the pangolin or something like that, or feed the lion. That's going to be fun. So we have demos that happen throughout the day that have times on them. You could even have multiple demos. Demos are usually based around an animal and usually at a habitat. Sometimes not, but usually at a habitat. All these things are they're just connected. They're connected in the real world and they have cardinality. And it's just true. So our job, one of our first jobs in the OUX world is figure out what are the things and how do they connect and what is the cardinality of them connecting. So I can say an animal has one-to-many habitats. I might even say an animal usually just has one habitat, but often they can have up to 3 habitats. So an animal has one-to-many habitats. A demo happens at a habitat or at 0-to-1 habitats. Maybe sometimes it's like at the visitor center or something like that, and it's not at a habitat. So a demo has one, maybe it's always one. A demo has one animal, but maybe like the bird show or something, a demo might have multiple animals. So these are the questions that I actually want to ask my client because this is going to go straight into the design of literally the demo detail page. Can a demo have one? It has one animal. Can it have 0 animals? Can a demo just be like the fossil show or something like that? So there's actually no animals in the demo. Should we actually call this an event? Is an event a better word? So these have cardinality. They have connections. It's just true. And then you go to the Denver Zoo website. Anybody could go right now to the Denver Zoo website and you'll go to the animal detail page and it's not connected to demos and it is not connected to habitats. None of these things are actually connected. They're all completely isolated from each other. And this is actually, we spend so much time and effort thinking about the navigation. When we say the navigation, we think about the little bar along the side or the little bar along the top. And that's great. And we need that. But there's nothing inherently intuitive about clicking along a list of links. Like we've just been trained to do that over the last 30 years or something like that. The most intuitive way to navigate is through relationships that actually already exist in the real world, that we're already used to, that exist in our mental model. And so a massive part of the OUX process is first identifying the things, which is sometimes actually in abstract scenarios like domains like insurance or finance or something like that. When you have really abstract objects, that can actually be really difficult. So making sure you have good, solid names and definitions for all your objects, and then figuring out how they connect to everything else so that we can further define them within a context. Because as Richard Saul Warman tells us, the grandfather of information architecture, you can really only define a thing and how it's connected to other things in a given domain. That's how you really understand a thing, is how it relates to the other things in the domain. So we build out all those relationships and something that looks like an entity relationship diagram. What we do is we actually build a nested object matrix, which is just a different way of visualizing and really systematically going through all those relationships in the nested object matrix, or the NOM, as we might call it, and then building the navigation to reflect that so that I can easily look at a demo detail page, see that this is a demo about the penguin, go and look at the penguin, see the habitats that the penguin has, learn more about the penguin. See, do I even want to go see this demo? Do I even care about penguins?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite examples from the course is when you identified a broken relationship in Airbnb. And Airbnb is like, oh, this is like the design company. Like they should have everything down. And it was refreshing to see during the course, and I won't spoil all of it, but you're pointing out very big multinational companies, like gaps in products where there's really big design team and product teams. So I think to set up this question,
you got to tell the Airbnb example. You can't tease it like
yeah, I'm gonna have you go
Oh,
over it a
okay.
little
All right.
bit.
I'll
But
talk it through.
so so I think it's better to hear from the person that actually found it. Talk about the concept of cardinality, because I mean, I didn't know what that was before I took the course. It's very common in engineering. Like, what's cardinality, and how did Airbnb break the law that law of cardinality? Because to go back to your point, there's a lot of things that are like related in the physical world that relationship doesn't make it into the design of a product yet.
So cardinality is a really difficult thing to define. This is true. So examples work a lot better. But basically, if I'm thinking about thing X and thing Y, I can say, if I'm looking at an instance of thing X, how many instances of thing Y could it possibly have? Could it have 0 of thing Y? Does it always have 1? Is it required that it always has 1 of thing Y? May it have multiple of thing Y? And then we even look even deeper and we say, if it has multiple, how many? Because there's so many really important design implications on how many. So
yeah, like what's the constraint, right? Like,
yeah, what's the constraint? Because that's going to affect how, if I'm looking at a list of those things within context of something else, do I need sorts? Do I need filters? Do I need groupings? What is the default sort? Like all these questions that we get into deeper in relationship requirements in the ORCA process, which we probably should talk about the ORCA process at some point. We'll get to that. But so an example, going back to architecture in the physical world, which is such a great analogy for all of this. If a house has one-to-many rooms, every house is going to have at least one room. It's a one-room house, right? So house has one-to-many rooms. Now, if I'm thinking about a certain context, we're working on a design challenge right now within the context of the OUX certification program. One of the design challenges that people are working through is a housing system for seniors, basically like a roommate system for seniors. And so the name of this fictional company is Golden Homes. And so within the context of Golden Homes, they have houses, all right? And then those houses have rooms within it that somebody could rent a room within the house. So I want to say, okay, a house has one-to-many rooms. I might even split it out even further and say a house has 0-to-many available rooms, and a house also has 0-to-many filled rooms, okay? So I might even break it out by status of the rooms. And then I would take a step further and I would make sure to ask, if I'm consulting with Golden Homes, I would make sure to ask, I've got a really good idea on how many rooms most houses have. So are your house, I'm going to assume that they're like 3 to 5 bedrooms-ish, but I don't want to assume anything, okay? Because that could be actually a high-risk assumption. Do you have homes that have 15 rooms? Because if you have home, and they might say, oh yeah, like we buy really big houses, as a consultant coming in, I got to ask these questions, especially if there's no existing system that I can go ahead and look at and dig in. And if there is, I can maybe answer this question myself and be really resourceful for this. But let's say it's not clear. And they come back and they say, oh yeah, about 50% of our houses are over 10 rooms. Okay, that's actually going to change the design. That's going to change if I'm looking at house detail page, whether I am an active user or an inactive user, this could change as well. But if I'm looking at a house detail page and many houses have up to 10 rooms, I actually might want some more sorting and filtering, okay? If I'm building software for, let's say, project management software, and team is an object and teams have members, I want to know, for this particular project management software that we're building, how many members do most teams have? For our audience, is it like 10 to 12 people? What is the average? Or is it like, oh no, in this software, our teams will usually have 300 members on it? That is going to change the design. So that's a little bit more about cardinality and how we actually dig into that even before we do any screens. We're doing this all in sticky notes.
And I just want to come in and say that basically the coolest realization for me is that problem domains are pretty consistent year over year. What you're doing when you're doing object discovery, and let's say that I think a way to describe it is like you're defining the nouns that in a problem, And then what cardinality does very well, if you like do it accurately, is that it gives you the constraints that you have to work with, right? So if there's like 10 rooms, you have to account for that in the UI. Like, how do you show 10 rooms in a user-friendly way? And if you don't do the legwork to find out like what the limit is, like what done looks like, you don't have to, like, you're not going to know what to do. And in my use of the framework, in my work, that's what MVP and small incremental releases and everything like that. But to be honest, real estate has been the way it was for decades.
Yeah.
And where I currently work in the produce industry, there's a certain way of doing business and business models that make it so that the world could be fed. And that's been for multiple decades since like globalization started. Once you establish that architecture, you might be good for a long time.
Oh yeah.
And then you could build any experience you want on top of it. And so this is also just a great way to make something that's like future proof and resilient. And that's what I just loved about it. And it makes me feel super confident in the experiences we're building at our company once we build this architecture out.
Yes, because we got to talk about pace layers. This is pace layers. And I forgot who created what's his name, who created pace layers. Whoever you are, pace layers guy, thank you. But pace layers is this idea of the things that change slowly. And then you have the things that change a little bit faster and then a little bit faster. I think at his bottom pace layer, it's like geology. And then on top of that, it's like country lines or something. I'm totally butchering this, but hopefully you get the idea. And then it's like culture is on top of that. And then at the very top, it's fashion. And then I think 𝗕𝗂𝗃 may have come up with the content strategy version of this. Or I'm sorry again if I'm miscrediting, but there's also versions of this for content strategy. And this is so true. The main things in the domain don't change that much. Like I was doing a workshop for a company, basically built marketing software for actually like placing ads on Google Ads. And it was B2B complex marketing software. And they had an object called an augmented line item. And I was like, what's an augmented line? What is this? Like, this doesn't exist anywhere else. And they're like, oh, that's our fancy word for it. It's basically a campaign. And I'm like, so why don't you just call it a campaign? This is not where you want to put your marketing effort, is giving cute names to things. Like marketers have literally been using the term campaign since what, like Mad Men, like 1960s, even before that. And it has a very specific meaning. And then you go and you look at, I use ActiveCampaign, or we used to use ActiveCampaign. We are now changing to ConvertKit because we are so fed up with ActiveCampaign. But ActiveCampaign, and I think MailChimp too, I don't know, but like ActiveCampaign, the way that they define campaign is actually not the way it has been historically defined. So they have something called a campaign, which is just an email. And then they have something called an automation, which is actually much more like a campaign, because when you think of a campaign, you're thinking of usually multiple pieces of content or art that is going out. You're not just thinking about the one thing. And so an email, an ActiveCampaign, like an email you send out to your list, they call that a campaign. And I'm like, historically, that's not really a campaign. So the way that we use words, if we can use these words and find these labels that have been in our users' mental model and in the vernacular for decades, and then we can match that. This is all about a user coming into a space, to your point at the top of the hour, coming into a space, whether that environment is digital or physical, you're designing this environment. If we can make it as familiar as possible to them. So if I'm designing, I used to work in ed tech, so I use a lot of ed tech examples, but if I'm designing an app for a teacher, okay, I want them to go into this app and they probably need to see students, classes, lessons, tests, depending on the goals of our app, maybe even parents, maybe even events at the school. But it's going to, what are the things in the teacher's mental model when it comes to this particular problem domain? I want them to open up that app and see those things, and they're immediately recognizable. They're consistent. They're recognizable, like I said, and they're also connected in a way that they're connected in the real world. So I should be able to navigate to the class and see all my students in the class and see all my assignments through that class. And I should be able to navigate to a student and see all the tests that they've taken. And we have so much software. And I would ask your listeners, can you, hand on heart, say that when a user, especially a new user, comes into your system, they immediately understand, here's all the concepts, the really important high-value concepts that are in this system. Here's how they're connected. here's what I can do to them. And from a permission standpoint, here's what other people can do to them based on their permissions. And here's all the important information about this thing. And I know exactly where to find it. Can you actually say that your users make that clear? Can you, yes. Can your users intuitively figure that out? Because if they can't, your system is not intuitive.
Well, yeah. And a rule of thumb is that if you use the words that they use to do their work, that correlates with intuitiveness and ease of use in the software. So where one argument I had, and I'm lucky I had the tools from your core, the computer's only as smart as the people programming going into these these debates at work, is like everyone's like, oh, like a purchase order and a shipment are like treated as one-to-one by the customer. And I'm like, then why are they two separate documents? Why is a shipping manifest and a purchase order two separate things in the real world? And they're like, oh, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, I think it does, because if we want to, what you guys keep talking about, automation, and if we're telling them that it's the same thing, how are they going to handle multiple bills of lading for one purchase order? Because you can only fit so much volume on a truck. And so I kept but now I was able to change my tact, and I just grilled them with questions. So like when I disagree with them, they'll be like, oh, it's not different. And then, so I'm like, okay, so do you see in like the next 5 years that we're just going to stop using purchase orders? They're like, no. And I'm like, okay, can there be multiple cargo containers for one same order? Yes. And I'm like, so please help me reconcile this. I must not be seeing what you're seeing. And then they're just like, okay, fine. And then the architecture was saved.
Yeah.
But I'm just imagining like this in most companies, like this happens all the time, where they just make oversimplistic decisions. Like the campaign one's a painful one for me, because I'm like, wait, it's just one email? It's like saying a war is just one battle.
Yeah, I know. That's a great example. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I recently got asked a question from somebody taking the course, and we were on a one-on-one, and she was saying, I feel and I see the value of this so deep in my soul. Basically, she's like, I can see myself becoming a better UX designer and asking better questions, just like you're asking better questions. But I had somebody ask me, and a colleague asked, what is the value of this really for the business? And the first thing I was like, well, what are the main pain points, right? Because it depends. What pain points is the business experiencing? Because OUX isn't going to solve all the pain points, right? But if your pain points are things like rework, or things like not communicating well with your developers, or things like, did I mention rework? This is massively beneficial to the business, because what happens is sometimes these things get into production and they're not quite right. And then we say, oh, we're just going to iterate on it. And I think so much we use iteration as a euphemism for rework. Or we only want to iterate in a really intelligent, smart way. We don't want to iterate because we didn't think things through, and we just put something out there hoping for the best. And then we have to iterate, we have to redo it, because also that's really disruptive to the user. So like when we're not, this OAUX it's a language around UX. It's a great way to document requirements and expose all these levels of complexity. And it's a great way to prevent these changes that happen later in the process, or even these changes that might need to happen in production. So if we can have these conversations early on when we're just like moving sticky notes around, sticky notes are cheap. So this is going to save so much money, because like another example, going back to cardinality that I use a lot, I've worked in working on EHRs and in the medical space. And I was working with a client, and I was looking at their object map. I was basically analyzing their object map, and it said a doctor has one location. I said, oh, is that true? Do any of your doctors work virtually? Can a doctor have 0 locations? Or do you consider online as a location? And also, like, my dad's a doctor, or was a doctor, he's retired now, and he would work out of multiple locations. He had a main location, but like on Wednesdays, he would be at this location. And then I'm thinking about my dermatologist. I'm like, oh, my dermatologist, she's always in Buckhead on Fridays. So can't a doctor have multiple locations? And this has implications, like you were saying, on the screen, right? So I'm looking at a doctor detail page, and I need to be able to design it so that doctor has 0 locations, or the doctor might have 4 locations. I want to design that page in a way that's flexible enough and can accommodate for all those use cases. But this has major implications on the database too. So if we say, oh, yep, there's a doctor and then there's a location. our developers might develop it one way that we're going to have to, that's going to create a massive amount of technical debt later on, because now we have some doctors that come back and they're like, wait, we have 3 locations. This is technical architecture too.
You have to make a new location and a new doctor instance for the same person 3 different times.
Yeah, or location may have just been added as metadata. Oh, this is their location. Here's just a little bit of metadata about their location. It's actually, location is the thing that not only has just the it actually has hours.
What kind of machines do they have? So I had to go to really out of my way to do like an ultrasound with like my wife, and like that location had the 3D ultrasound technology. Like I couldn't just go to any ultrasound place.
Yeah.
How would I have known that if it's just a line on metadata?
Right. You might even want to filter locations by the machine that it has. Maybe it doesn't matter because it's a lab tech. You don't care who the person is. It's not like you wanted to go see your doctor. It's more about the machine that's there, and you want the 3D version so you can basically put your VR goggles on and see your baby in 3D, that's going to happen. That's going to happen soon.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. Moms are going to put their VR goggles and they're going to be inside their own womb. We live in the future. But yeah, totally. What if it comes out that a doctor, actually it would be really great for the user if we saw that schedule. That also, it's not just showing, hey, Dr. Abbott, here's all the locations that she works at, but that this is the location that she's at on Friday, and she's only there till 3 p.m. Like, are we going to that level of detail? So this is another thing for all the PMs listening. This is a great tool to figure out scope. Scope is requirement. Right. Like, what the hell are we actually building? Scope was one of the biggest headaches for when I was in the agency world, especially, but also internal as well, to scope out a project and say, what are we building? What are the lines on this? How are we actually delineating what is in scope? And for estimation purposes, okay, is scheduling, is that in scope? Are we showing that? Are we not showing that? Are we going to that level of detail? Because if we are, that's adding a certain level of complexity. So this is a way to bring stakeholders in, bring your subject matter experts in, bring the business in, and help them realize how complicated it actually is. One of the things that sometimes people who don't understand OUX, understand what we're trying to do here, they might hear about it. And some of your listeners might be thinking about this. Are you just overcomplicating things? And it's no, what this process does is it exposes the inherent complexity in a system. All right, we're not overcomplicating stuff. But what we're doing is we're making sure we don't undercomplicate stuff, which is often what we do. And all the complicated stuff is then left to the developer at the 11th hour. It's like, let's just figure that out. I mean,
this work needs to be done at some point, and if we just leave it to the engineers,
we'll be user-centered.
I wonder. Yeah, and the big thing for me is it's just the idea that and I've had that said to me before, and you're overcomplicating it, and then I just shoot back, and I'm just like, I don't think you're actually thinking this through, which really makes me not trust your judgment. Yeah. And so I'm petty. I like to be snarky sometimes. I think I've earned that privilege.
Another thing that's really good to say, if somebody says you're overcomplicating it, you're posing all these questions, using the example of can a purchase order show up as multiple deliveries, or is a purchase order always going to show up as one delivery, for example? Because again, that's going to have implications in the design, but also the database design as well. And detailed requirements need to be thought through there if it's one way or the other. So let's say somebody says you're overcomplicating things. It doesn't really matter. Say, okay, this is what you do. You say, okay, I'm just going to assume that a purchase order is always going to be one delivery. How high risk is that assumption? So if it does turn out that it's multiple, how bad is that going to be?
Based off your understanding, because you've been in the customer interviews with me, do you feel like that's risky?
Yes, and make them say that it's low risk. And say, okay, I'm just gonna write that down that you said that this is low risk. It is Friday, November 17th at 1:58 p.m. Great, wonderful. I'll just go design it that way. You don't have to be quite so sassy as I just was, but this idea of if people are asking you to design based on assumptions, this process is going to help you expose all those assumptions. It's going to help you expose all the unknown unknowns. And then you can ask the questions about it. You can ask these really juicy, deep questions, which is one of the biggest values of this, is getting these questions out in the open. And then what you can do is then, if you're being told you're overcomplicating things, fine. Just make sure that you understand the risks of those assumptions.
Oh, yeah. And then you could even just keep going. You could just grill them and say, and I'm not condoning any aggressive tax. This is just like professional responsibility that you need to push your team to think deeper. That if they say, if you do ask them a question and they're like, oh yeah, it's like 1-to-1, then I'm like, wait, what about that one story where they said that there was multiple shipments for one? And so I don't understand. And they're like, well, yeah, you need to account for that too. And I'm like, okay, you just confirmed like the observation there. Okay, we're going to take a quick break from our scheduled programming. If you're enjoying this podcast and you've gotten any value out of it so far, I have a special request for you. I'm currently writing a book on product team collaboration, and I want to get the message out there. So if you want to take a moment and hit subscribe in your podcast app, that would mean the world to me, and it would be super helpful in booking better guests, getting better content out there, and getting the message of this book out to more people. So whether you have to pause this podcast or you like multitasking while listening to it, just take a moment and hit subscribe on the show page and show your support. Again, thanks for listening. Now back to the show.
Yeah.
Like I think designers have given up fighting back because they haven't had to articulate their instinct. You could see design have really good cardinality and all this stuff, and they didn't do the object-oriented UX process. They just did it intuitively because they just are good designers or whatever. But then, like, when asked, like, why do you do it this way, they can't articulate why. What I love about object-oriented UX is that I actually have a vocabulary and toolkit to articulate when talking to the customer. These are like these are the artifacts they use to get this task done. And what I noticed is that this is the relationship between these things, and this is how many things. Like, usually one employee has one computer. You don't have like 2 MacBooks to a designer. Usually, it's usually 1-to-1 relationship. But I'd actually really like to hear the story of how you discovered the Airbnb thing. I'm just going to go into it because I've
been teasing it.
I know, this is how I keep people listening. I just keep stringing them along. Oh, let's change topic. Anyways, the thing for me that really clicked is seeing like a really good design driven company mess this up, and it shows like, oh, this is why they reorganized their company away from like cross-functional independent teams. Like, it used to be like they are doing the trio model, and which for listeners that don't understand what I'm saying, it's Marty Kagan. You have these product teams that are like a PM, a designer, and an engineering lead, and they focus on one part of the product. But what Airbnb was noticing is that all over the product, everything looked like it was going in different directions. Velocities were going in different vectors, and people were starting to complain as the company grew. They downsized, they leaned up the team, and then Brian's like, I want this app to look like only 10 people worked on it. And so they kind of like this dictatorial, like Steve Jobs Apple style. I wouldn't say it's dictatorial, like they still empower their teams, but they're just like, no, one roadmap for all of Airbnb. These are the experiences that matter to us. And one great example of that time when it was just a bunch of product feature teams is the neighborhood. Yeah. I don't know if a lot of people have actually seen a neighborhood page.
It's so cool.
Can you kind of explain why no one's seen it?
Yeah, and that example I think was from like 2019 or something.
Oh, that's when Airbnb was struggling.
Yeah, and I haven't looked back. I think it may have been fixed. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that this has been fixed. But the experience, at least back in 2019, is they had these beautiful neighborhood detail pages. It wasn't for every neighborhood, but it was for like the big important neighborhoods. So I'll just use Atlanta as an example. So they might have a Virginia Highlands neighborhood page. They might have a Midtown neighborhood page. They might have a West End neighborhood page. And on those, they were beautiful. They had beautiful images, as Airbnb does, like professional shot images that you could get a vibe of the neighborhood. They had metadata about it, whether it's like, what's the noise level in that neighborhood? Is it more quiet? Is there a lot to do there? Are there bars? They even had like locals having quotes about the neighborhood too. So there was these nested objects of quotes from the locals, I believe. And then they even pulled in their experiences. So this is when Airbnb was coming out with their experiences. So here's experiences you could do in the neighborhood. And there was a big missing piece on the neighborhood, the structure of this neighborhood detail page, the neighborhood object, if you will. And that was the actual listings, the actual homes that you could stay in that neighborhood. They were not featured there. It actually showed a little map, but there was nothing that connected it. So I could go to that neighborhood page. I could go to the Virginia Highlands, or I'll use Reynoldstown. I used to live there. So I go to the Reynoldstown neighborhood page and I could see all the cool street art, and I could see that I could go eat at the Golden Eagle there, and somebody was doing a Beltline tour that went through there, and I could see none of the listings. I could not see the 30 listings that exist within Reynoldstown. And then I would go over to the listing page and I could find I could zoom in on the map and find Reynoldstown and find a listing, an Airbnb, if you will, an Airbnb that was in Reynoldstown, and nowhere did it connect back to the neighborhood page. And there are these like beautiful high value pages that, especially if you're going to a city that you've never been to before, like I recently went to Portland. I'd never been to Portland before. So I was doing research outside of Airbnb on like what the cool neighborhoods in Portland were, and then going back to Airbnb. And even though these neighborhood pages existed and could have been super helpful and like great from an SEO perspective, they had completely disconnected that this would be an isolated object, because those things are so front of mind in the user's mental model. Like a home has one neighborhood, and neighborhood has many homes. That's just true. And that truth was not honored in the user interface and in the user experience.
Well, especially in like, say like Barcelona, there's like if you go on like travel TikTok or YouTube, they talk about like the best neighborhoods, the type of experience you want to have, right? And then that would be like an awesome filter for searching, where it's like, oh, I want Airbnbs in this neighborhood because I want to be close to where all the action is. I want to be near the Sagrada Familia and all that stuff. And yeah, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. I did a quick search. I don't know if that's
not
that made it. But I don't even know how you navigate to a neighborhood page. But this was 2019, like before they did this transformation, and I honestly feel like that's exactly like what Brian's like. Airbnb felt fragmented, disjointed. There was all these teams going off, and they were empowered, so they weren't like talking to each other. You could tell that they're built by two different teams, and so the quality of the app, it showed, right? And so until they actually centralized the vision of the company and the roadmap, they were just going to keep having these broken relationships in their system, which is really disappointing. And I think that's like an inevitable risk of growing as a business, is if you don't solve this now, it gets harder.
Yeah, it's the kludge factor. It's like this thing that it's just so true in our industry. As a product gets more mature, it's shittier. Like, why? Like, why does it have to happen like that? And it's because of all these things that you're talking about. I mean, I was just thinking with Airbnb, like how cool it would be even if that neighborhood object was actually incorporated in the search results page. So if I'm looking at a map of all of the listings and there's neighborhoods that they actually have these beautiful detail pages on, could they show a little outline of that neighborhood? And I could actually click on the neighborhood and zoom in to all the homes in that neighborhood, or even see a different little flyout. So you get the little flyouts for the listing. What if I had a little flyout for the neighborhood and I was like, oh, okay, all these 6 homes are in this neighborhood, and here I can just scroll through some pictures of the neighborhood. Like, mwah, chef's kiss. I would love that. That would be amazing.
Imagine, because like right now it's like the current Tyria is like best performing host, like how like beautiful the place is. I think one problem I had was that like I picked an Airbnb, but it was like but when we checked in, we're like, oh shoot, this is way out of the way of all I wanted to do.
And this is something that like, so one thing we do at the very beginning of the process, and we do need to talk about the Orca process before we go. We're gonna end at the beginning.
How about you incorporate?
Yeah.
Because actually, let me like actually do like a shift in the conversation so that you can talk more about it. Like for me, a lot of people are like, a lot of lean purists are going to be like, this sounds like waterfall. So I guess framing how your process works in a way that you would answer that question. Like, this sounds like a lot of work, and we got to be fast and blah, blah, blah. And you got to learn and ship and everything like that. Like, how would you respond to that question?
I would be really snarky. I'd be really snarky, which I will be. I'm not going to hold back. Is okay, Agile, how's that working out for you? Does your product still suck? I mean, technology still sucks across the board. Like technology, people hate technology. It's annoying. Like maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. We got burned by waterfall. And so we like shifted, the pendulum swung, and we all know, us Americans know about the pendulum swinging back and forth, right? And anyways, we won't get into that. But the pendulum swung all the way to Agile. And we're just going to work in these like myopic 2-week chunks. Like, what is there about that like inherently makes any sense? The Agile manifesto, hell yeah. I am all about the Agile manifesto. Like, everything in that makes so much sense. But Agile has been basically, I think it's been quite bastardized, actually. It just means we're going to work in 2-week work segments. So it's like this Agile-ish. Anyway, I can get more into Agile, but I actually want to loop back to one thing, and then we're going to pop back because I wanted to say something about the neighborhood and how one of the first things that we do in this process is we do this noun foraging, where we look for all those nouns that get used over and over again, and we can actually prioritize those nouns. So if we did a bunch of user interviews about how you decide on your Airbnb and the word neighborhood gets used over and over and over again, I can, from a product management perspective and a product design perspective, I can say, it looks like the neighborhood is a really important concept for our end users. Like, this is how a large percent of our users are actually finding and deciding on where to actually stay. So I can actually move that up in the roadmap and say, let's prioritize the neighborhood object. How can we weave the neighborhood object in more into our design? Or if I do a bunch of user interviews and nobody's mentioning that doesn't even come up. It's like we're just outliers when we decide, like, maybe it's just you and me, Kaden, that like to shop by neighborhood, okay? Then they can also find that and be like, it's really only like a few of our users that really shop this way. So let's really deprioritize the neighborhood object or even sunset it because people aren't using it.
Or it's only for a few select like famous cities, right?
Yeah. So to go back, so I just wanted to close the loop on our Airbnb thing that we teased for so long. But and how like prioritization and actually a product roadmap can start being designed based on, instead of based on feature, you can actually base it on object and how much you're prioritizing different objects. Yeah. I think it's actually a much better way to divide complexity. We still need to divide complexity by feature and functionality, but then all the features and functionalities have to do with certain objects. But to go back to this sounds like a lot of work, or this sounds like very waterfall-y. So the Orca process is in its beautiful entirety is 15 steps. 15 steps.
What does Orca stand for?
Orca stands for objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. And it's this iterative process. And I was listening to a previous episode of yours where you were talking about the role of UX architect, right? And you brought up the double diamond and how UX can fit as like this third diamond in between the double diamond. So this is how I see it working. Like, we've got research. Nobody's thinking it. If they are misguided. Nobody's thinking that research needs to happen within 2-week sprints, right? Like, we're doing research. Sometimes bodies of research need to take months to plan and figure out. So there is guerrilla research. We can do it quick and we can do it dirty, and Just Enough Research. Great book, Erica Hall, I believe. But we do our research, and then what we do is we jump straight into solutions. We do a little bit of problem definition, but there's no architecting that's happening. There's no figuring out how do we synthesize all of that research and turn it into really good structure that our design effort can hang on, that our detailed information architecture and taxonomy efforts can hang on, and that, of course, our technical architecture can also be based on as well.
Yeah, they're prioritizing. Oh man, like you've struck a nerve. And I've been working on this presentation for years about how the define step in like design thinking is like usually skipped, and you're not prioritizing by objects, you're prioritizing by customer anecdotes. You're like, one customer said this, oh, how can we solve it? And they start thinking about how they're going to solve that one person's anecdote.
Yeah.
Instead of the actual like synthesis of defining what the actual problem space is.
So prioritization is this huge part in the Orca process. And what I'll say, yes, 15 steps, and I'll go over those steps real quick, but like those 15 steps, you never do all the 15 steps in exactly the 15-step order. This is a bag of tricks that as an OUXer, you to pull, to bend, you need to break, you remix them. It's all in service of stuff that's already being done. I always think this is not a process to replace your existing process. You add this way of thinking, you add this definition of your O's, your R's, your C's, and your A's, and it supports everything else you do. It makes everything else you do a lot easier. And it is one of those things as far as speed and, is this waterfall? And this is a lot of big design up front. This is an incredibly scalable process. Spend 1 day on it and you're going to get benefits. Spend 4 hours on it and you're going to get benefits. Totally scalable. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. Maximum, usually my Orca sprints that I run with companies are 1 week. 1 week for an Orca sprint. 2 weeks are great for something that's really complicated. And then you can start going and you can start designing from that. Does not need to be this massive effort. The other thing is, on top of it being scalable, the other thing is you can apply the Orca process to a single page. If you are being asked, if you are in a situation right now where you are being asked to design basically pretty myopically, and you're said, oh, we're just going to redesign this cog in the machine without thinking about the whole machine, like you're just doing this one page or these 3 pages that are part of this flow, you can apply the process to just that little piece of the system. And what it will help you do is see how the things in that piece that you're being tasked with actually connect to everything else. So it can help you push the boundaries a little bit, and it can help you communicate across those silos of, this isn't necessarily in the body of work that I've been tasked with, but I should go talk to this person over here because the thing that I'm working on here actually connects to something over there. Let me find who's responsible for that. Let me make sure that we can maybe not introduce another shapeshifter. All right. Or we can prevent some masking because this object there's an object that shows up on this page, or 3 objects that show up on this page, and those objects actually show 17 other pages. So it can help you with that as well.
Clarify what masking is.
So masking is that is the 2 different things wearing the same outfit. The classic
which is
example.
very common in the UI card, like the trendy UI card with some drop shadow attached to it.
Yeah, just put anything in there. It's so flexible. Just put anything in there.
Throw a card, make a card.
Just make a card. It's all cards. Yeah, you want your cards to be very specific. And this is something that, in coming from industrial design, this would have been insane to design the packaging before we design what the actual thing is. So much of what OUX is about is, let's figure out what are people actually coming for? What are those really important concepts? And then we'll design really great packaging that actually makes sense for those different things. So it's really clear what is being packaged. So yeah, the last thing I'll say about waterfall, and I could go on and on, I know I'm in a soapbox right now, is this is one of those cases of let's slow down to speed up. Let's take a beat. Let's take a breath. Let's think through this a little bit more. Let's take 1 extra week to think through this a bit more to make sure the thing that we're designing actually makes sense. And we're going to save so much time in usability testing because, oh my gosh, things are going to be intuitive out the gate, right? It's going to be much less iteration.
Tailor fit it. Yeah. We just tailor fit it to how they understand things. And
Exactly. And you're going to save so much time in communicating with your developers because holy moly, your developers should be involved in this collaborative process. Have them in there so that they're saying, oh, wait, actually, those 2 databases don't talk to each other. So we can bring our developers in early. And then actually our developers can be working on system architecture and building out this API that they didn't know that they needed while we're working on the front end. So as UX designers, we're no longer a bottleneck. So we can actually save a lot of time because our developers aren't waiting around for designs or anything like that. If that does happen in your organization, bring your developers in, collaborate, and make sure the stuff that's actually going through the prioritization round, because there's a whole round of Orca for prioritization where you prioritize from the lens of your O's, your R's, your C's, your A's, your objects, your relationships, your call to action, and your attributes. So there's so many benefits to working this way to actually go faster with less headaches and a lot more beautiful collaboration. And on top of that, it's actually really fun too. It's a fun process. It feels game-like.
Yeah, because the reward is clarity on what you need to do and build. And I think everyone wants that at some point. They just don't have the tools to get to that level of clarity in a way that actually makes sense in a software environment, or I'd argue in any kind of product or business. Even service design could benefit from this, right? Because then you could say that this object is a physical touch point in the customer journey, but how does this physical touch point interact with the data? Oh, and what object in the database does it interact? Because then you could get a lot more creative. And that's why I'm I don't know if I ever want to do SaaS in my career. I've always done hybrid service businesses that you need to a scale with technology to deliver a service. And so I guess my experience, I'll just go over the different phases. And maybe this is my certification test.
Yes.
Is the
rounds.
But so the Orca, so it's geez, now I'm all nervous. It's the relationships, calls to actions, and attributes, right? And you do that, you go through that acronym 4 times. The first round is discovery. So you're basically just defining the objects, the relationships between those objects, the calls to action, which I think something that totally gets ignored in most discovery. It's like, what do we want them to do with this? Like,
And who's doing it? We define roles in that
who's doing
step.
it?
Like we
Yeah.
go straight into permissions, which is a huge problem in our
Yeah.
industry.
You could actually start defining roles and permissions from which is always like an afterthought. It's like in the MVP, everyone's an admin, and then we'll figure out the roles later. And then attributes is like the content and like what actually gives that object character, right? And so you have the intentionality, like, hey, why is a picture of this farm on the wrong object or something like that? And then you do the discovery round, and then you do the requirements round. Sorry. Then you do is it prototyping and testing? I failed.
You failed the prioritization. I know it's a lot. It's a lot. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty dense.
It's
a dense course.
It's dense, but when you get to that prioritization round, you're really just eliminating stuff. We have some artifacts. We do the nav flow, which is really fun, but really that's where you're just road mapping the stuff. So you've gone through discovery. Discovery is often just asking a lot of really good questions, figuring out what you don't know, discovering what you don't know, also kicking stuff back to research because you can come up with all these good questions. And then you could, well, this is the unknowns. Let's kick those back to research and then move forward with what we do know. And then you go through the requirements and like just get really nitty gritty and basically write requirements for the O's, the R's, the C's, and the A's. And then prioritization is where you're like, okay, let's build a roadmap now. Like what parts of this is phase 1? What parts is phase 2? So you're prioritizing it from a business perspective as far as the roadmap, but also from the user perspective of what attributes need to be on the card. What attributes should not be a click away on a detail page. So you're actually figuring out date and time, like, or price. Like, does price need to be up here or can price be down here? So you're prioritizing and you're prioritizing your calls to action too. Should the delete button be on the card, or is it okay if somebody needs to click into the detail page to see the delete button? How often do people use the delete button? So you're prioritizing from a user and a business perspective.
Yeah. And I want to respect your time. I could keep geeking out about this for a long time. But I think the biggest benefit for me in my career is that it's allowed me to design UIs through other designers. Because if I could take someone through this process and be like, okay, I need you to design this flow, and then you go over the object map with them and the attributes, and it's like, hey, this attribute's more important than this attribute. And you basically just give them like the content requirements, like you give them the relationships, and you could basically give that to a designer, and then they're like, oh, yeah, I know what to do. And then if they're good at like visual hierarchy and all that stuff, they do something that I would have done. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like we've just been able to scale efforts by doing it this way, which so it helps with org design and execution, because you establish a level of tact with the problem that is so perfect. It is a lot of work. It's going to fry your brain, but man, just like I'd fry my brain for 2 weeks to fry my brain in 2 weeks so that I could not stress for the next year.
Yeah.
100% worth it.
Oh, but you make it sound so painful. It's so fun though. It's just moving sticky notes around. It's like a hard board game. It's like playing a really difficult board game. That's how I describe it. It's a puzzle.
My favorite analogy, and I thought about this going through your courses, I'm like, I feel like she's explaining like Settlers of Catan to me.
Yeah.
Which I think if you want to learn like object-oriented UX, if you're a board game person, Settlers of Catan is a great game to play to learn. Because like, how do you explain a game? You explain the objects, like everybody. It doesn't matter how familiar you are with object-oriented systems. If someone likes a game, they're going to be like, okay, like in football, you have these things, and you have the field, and you have balls, and like, their job is to do this. And like nouns is how humans think. And you talk about this in your course. But Sophia, I want to respect your time. Do you feel like there is anything that has been not said that needs to be said before we sign off? And then I'll let you talk about what you're working on. And
yeah, there's like the things that haven't been said is like the 22 hours of content in the OUX masterclass. No, I think we covered so much here. I do just want to come back.
You get your money's worth.
Yeah. I've heard people say, I watch these videos over and over again. So the one thing I do just want to loop back to is what you were just talking about is this fact that you could create an object map, this beautiful color-coded sticky note documentation thing, artifact basically. It's like a way of showing X-ray vision into a system. So you can have this object map. You could deliver it to a interface designer or a UI designer who understands how to read it. Takes about 10 minutes to learn how to read it. And then they can move on. They can move on from that, and they could go ahead and they could start designing screens from this if they understand the sort of principles behind OUX. So for all the PMs listening, the people that are actually having to own the requirements, y'all, stop doing wireframes. This is not what you're good at. You're not good at doing wireframes. You're just stepping on the designer's toes. Build an object map. Like, this is a much better way to give the definition, a much more, you're going to be able to get into more detail, and you're going to be doing the thing that you're doing best at, which is actually defining the system. That is, as a product owner, as a UX architect, if we use that term as well, as a system designer, you don't step away from designing the screens. Design what needs to go on the screens and let the people who love designing screens and love that level of detail and that level of rigor, let them do that. Okay? This is a really nice way to divide and conquer. And of course, work with them, bring them in. Like, the whole object mapping process should be really collaborative. Bring the whole team in. And then maybe that is the thing that you own. You can own that object map and really help inform those designs. But I don't think you need to be doing any wireframing. Hot take. Hot take.
No, I agree, because it's too myopic. And when you haven't defined the problem, like, it's so risky to even just like think about screens, because it could just be an API call. We might not need the screen. So once we figure it out, like,
or you might have a voice UI, right? Like, it might be a screen, but then the exact same documentation of an object map can inform a voice UI or a chatbot.
Exactly. A smarter one. And then I'm imagining, in the world of AI, like feeding an object map an AI and be like, oh man, that's some powerful stuff.
It's coming.
And I'm going to try out a GPT now. But so, yeah, I think like product managers could definitely benefit from this framework. How can they get access to this awesome course?
Yeah, for sure. So the self-paced masterclass is always available, oaux.com/masterclass. I will actually send your listeners to a different URL, though. I'm going to send them to oaux.com/hi/𝗨𝗏𝗏. Okay. And we'll link up some of the resources that I've mentioned, but we'll also have a discount code for you. So the discount code will be 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏, and that's going to give you 10% off this masterclass. Go to that URL and I'll have some other information for you there. Some of the resources that we mentioned, some other resources that I think would be great for your audience, Caden. But you can also, if you want to learn more about it, go to oaux.com/masterclass. And we also have a certification program that we run in cohorts. We usually run 2 to 3 cohorts a year. We're finishing up cohort 9 now, and we'll be enrolling for cohort 10 probably in February or so. So if you want to get on the wait list for that, you can go to oaux.com/certification. The other thing I'll point people toward is the newsletter, oaux.com/newsletter. You'll get a free 55-page launch guide. And stay tuned, because I'm going to be creating a GPT soon. So we're going to be putting all the resources together, and we're going to be creating a Sophia bot that we'll be able to ask questions and potentially even feed a screenshot into, and it might spit out an object map for you. Yeah, so the next cohort, not sure exactly when that's going to be at the time of this recording. We're not sure. Likely it's going to be February. So maybe by the time that this episode is launching, we will be live with cohort 10. So you can go to oaux.com/certification to either get on the wait list or go ahead and enroll in cohort 10. But the main URL, and I'll put all of these links in there, is going to be oaux.com/hi/𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏. And we'll have all those goodies for you right there.
Yeah, I'll make sure that those are in the show notes. I think that's a very valuable discount, so you don't have to pay full price like I did.
Oh,
but I would no, worthy investment. I mean, I got promoted. I didn't mention that part. I got promoted doing that project. So it's okay.
And we hear that a lot. We hear that a lot, that people get promoted because of the way that they're thinking. They're thinking at a deeper level. They're doing like 4D chess UX design.
Yeah, and it gives you a way to get the complexity on somewhere besides your head, because I think thinking is suffering, and if you have to think about all this complexity and you don't have it in some digestible artifact, you're just going to lose track of where you are. And so this is a great way to be less stressful at work, for me, because I'm like, okay, at least I know I've done the work, I've documented it, I know where everything fits, and I could confidently speak to any part of the system better than most people. But so I think the return on investment from the raise, from the promotion, I think is a good ROI. I think it's better than the S&P 500 if I calculate it.
Cool. So I'll see you in cohort 10, right? Everybody join Caden for cohort 10.
Yeah. Sophia, thank you so much for coming on the show. You have a good one.
All right. You too, Caden. Bye. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Hey listener, thanks again for listening to The Way of Product. As we power down today's session on the fusion of creativity and technology, let's solidify the energy you've gotten from our dialogue today. If you've gleaned insights or strategies that could turbocharge your projects, I have a small but powerful ask. Swing by the platform where you're hearing this and leave a review. Think of it as your digital high five to us. It's a fuel that propels this content to more creative technologists like you, amplifying the impact of the shared knowledge. So until our next interview, keep pioneering and pushing the envelope. Thanks again for lending your ears and your imagination to our community. Catch you on the next download. Is everyone gone yet? Because this next offer is for you. And this is because you listened all the way to the end of this episode. Today's episode is sponsored by 𝗥𝗲𝘃, a name you might not be familiar with yet, but one you'll definitely want to remember. I don't know about you, but most meetings are terrible. Long circular discussions, weeks with no progress. I was tired of that. Tired of good energy getting sucked out of potentially explosive creative sessions. So I finally decided to do something about it. That's why I started 𝗥𝗲𝘃. Think of 𝗥𝗲𝗃 as a special ops for team collaboration. We're the ones you call for remote or on-site workshops where you need to get your product team aligned and moving without the usual drag. No more endless circles or feeling like you're herding cats. I've been there. I've been stuck in the muck of misalignment, watching the clock while creativity just fizzles out. That's not how breakthroughs happen. 𝗥𝗲𝗃 workshops are built differently. They are the cure to the common meeting. And because I believe in the power of what we're doing, I'm offering something special to Way of Product listeners. If your team's feeling stuck, let's talk. I'm opening my calendar for free 25-minute coaching calls to audit your team's collaboration issues. We'll dissect the problem areas, and I'll share techniques and tactics tailored to your situation to help you get unblocked and back in the flow. Think of it as a turbo boost for your team's productivity. So here's what you do. Visit wayofproduct.com/workshops. Get all the details, sign up for your free coaching call, and let's start turning those meeting groans into high fives. All right. Thanks for listening to the full episode. And remember, with 𝗥𝗲𝗃, it's not just a meeting, it's a turning point. Talk to you soon.